The rusted iron sign of the old stagecoach station swung violently on its chains, shrieking against the frozen wind. Ice had already sealed the deep ruts in the road, wiping away any proof that a wagon had been here just 3 hours ago. That was all it took for the world to vanish. 3 hours. Sarah Miller pressed her spine against the cracked wooden boards of the station door. Her breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, each one tearing at her throat like swallowed glass. The gray wool of her dress was torn at the hem, stiff with frozen black mud, offering no protection against the punishing blue blizzard that swept across the frontier pass. She pulled her knees to her chest, trembling violently, but the cold had already bypassed her skin. It was settling deep into her bones, a heavy numbing weight that made closing her eyes dangerously tempting. Inside her pocket, her frostbitten fingers desperately clutched a folded square of parchment. It was the only thing keeping her awake. The debt paper. Her stepmother had not sent her here to catch a coach to a better life. There was no ticket. There was no relative waiting at the end of the line. The driver had simply stopped at this abandoned outpost, dragged her out by her arm, and driven away into the snow. Only when the sound of the hooves faded did Sarah find the paper pinned inside her cloak. It bore the signature of a ruthless mining town creditor. She had been traded, sold to clear a ledger discarded like broken furniture in the winter wilderness. The wind howled a low guttural sound that rattled the decaying timbers of the station. Sarah lowered her head onto her knees. Her lips were cracked, a faint line of dried blood at the corner of her mouth. She was going to die out here. The creditor's men would find her frozen, a useless piece of property that didn't even make it to the auction block. The thought brought a strange, bitter relief. At least the cold took nothing but her life. It did not take her dignity. Inside the station behind the thick oak door, Gideon Hale sat still as stone. The heavy elk-hide duster hung loosely over his broad shoulders as he methodically rubbed oil into the barrel of his Winchester rifle. The fire in the half-broken stone hearth crackled, throwing long amber shadows across his weathered face. His dark, deep-set eyes were fixed on the dancing flames, but his ears were tuned to the storm. Gideon had lived in this ruined station for 2 winters. He had seen the frontier swallow men whole. He knew the sounds of the mountain past the cracking of pine branches under heavy snow, the distant wail of wolves, the shifting of ice on the ridge. But a few minutes ago he heard something else, a thud against his front door. A sound too soft to be a fallen branch, too heavy to be the wind. He paused, the oiled rag resting on the dark walnut stock of his rifle. He waited. The wind screamed again, but beneath it came the faint, desperate sound of teeth chattering. It was the visceral, unmistakable rhythm of a human body failing. Gideon's square jaw tightened. He had left the world of men behind because of its endless cruelty. He did not ask for visitors. He did not offer charity. But the wilderness had its own brutal code, and Gideon had never been a man who could sit by a warm fire while someone died on his doorstep. He stood, his massive frame towering in the low-ceilinged room. He set the rifle on the table, unlatched the heavy iron bolt, and gripped the rusted handle. Outside, Sarah felt the wooden boards behind her back suddenly give way. She gasped, tumbling backward into a rush of overwhelming wood smoke-scented warmth. The transition from the blinding blue storm to the amber light of the cabin was so sudden she threw her hands up, expecting a blow. Through the haze of her freezing tears, she looked up. A shadow blocked the doorway, broad-shouldered and immense. For a terrifying second, she thought the creditor's men had already found her. But as her vision cleared, she saw the man standing over her. He wore a long, weathered elk-hide duster. His face was forged in harsh masculine lines, a strong Roman nose, a heavy jaw, and dark eyes that studied her with a quiet, piercing intensity. He did not look like a monster, nor a savior. He looked like the mountain itself. Gideon stared down at the pale, shivering woman crumpled on his floorboards. Her brown-red hair was crusted with frost, clinging to her hollow cheeks. Her lips were blue. She was curled defensively, one hand clutching her chest, the other buried deep in the pocket of her ragged gray dress. He saw the sheer terror in her wide, ocean-blue eyes. She looked at him as if he were another trap waiting to spring. He did not speak. Words were useless to a body dying of cold. Gideon pushed the heavy door shut, leaning his weight against it until the rusted latch clicked into place, instantly cutting off the shrieking wind. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, save for the crackle of the fire and Sarah's ragged breathing. Slowly, deliberately, Gideon knelt before her. He kept his hands visible, moving with the measured calm of a man approaching a wounded animal. Sarah flinched, pressing her back against the door, her hand tightening around the folded paper in her pocket. Asterisk, "He knows, asterisk," her panicked mind whispered. Asterisk, he knows I'm worth money. He knows I'm a runaway. But Gideon didn't reach for her pocket. He didn't ask her name or why she had been dumped at the edge of the world. Instead, he reached for a battered metal canteen resting near the hearth. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Drink!" His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, startling in the quiet room. Sarah stared at the canteen, then up at his weathered face. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't uncurl her fingers. Seeing her struggle, Gideon moved closer. He didn't force her. He gently cupped his large, rough hand over hers, guiding the canteen to her cracked lips. The water was warm. It hit her frozen stomach like a sudden spark, forcing a ragged cough from her throat. "Slowly," he commanded softly. As she drank, a piece of white parchment slipped a fraction of an inch from her torn pocket. Gideon's dark eyes caught the movement. He saw the heavy black ink, the official red wax seal broken at the edge. A contract. He looked away, his expression unchanging, and pulled his elk-hide duster from his shoulders, wrapping the heavy, life-saving warmth around her trembling frame. The storm raged outside, but inside, the first fragile thread of safety had just been woven. The transition from freezing to thawing was not a gentle one. As the amber heat of the hearth began to seep into Sarah's frozen limbs, the numbness was replaced by a vicious burning ache. Every nerve in her body screamed as blood forced its way back into her pale fingers and toes. She curled tighter into a ball, squeezing her eyes shut, unable to stop the violent tremors shaking her frame. The heavy elk-hide duster swallowed her completely. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the sharp, clean scent of pine. It was the smell of the wilderness, untamed but honest. Under the weight of the coat, her trembling fingers remained locked inside the pocket of her ruined gray dress, the edge of the folded debt paper digging into her palm. Even as her body fought to survive the cold, her mind could not let go of the truth. She was a fugitive asset, and men would come looking for what they owned. Gideon watched her from the shadows. He had seen frostbite before. He had seen strong men lose limbs, lose their minds, and lose their lives to the mountain passes. The woman on his floor was terrifyingly fragile. Her skin translucent in the firelight, her lips still carrying a dangerous bluish tint. He moved away from the door, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds against the floorboards. He knew better than to move too quickly. A creature that had been hunted learned to fear sudden motions. Gideon went to the rusted iron stove sitting beside the stone hearth. He lifted a heavy iron kettle, pouring water into a battered tin pot, and set it over the hottest coals. While the water heated, he walked to a wooden trunk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, faded and patched, but clean. Approaching Sarah, he stopped a few feet away. He waited until her glassy, fever-bright eyes met his. He did not want to surprise her. "The floor pulls the heat from your bones," Gideon said, his voice a low, steady rumble that somehow carried over the shrieking wind outside. "You need to be off the wood." He spread the blanket near the hearth, close enough to feel the radiant heat, but far enough to keep stray embers away. Then he stepped back, giving her space to move on her own. Sarah swallowed hard. Her throat was raw, parched from breathing the icy air. She tried to push herself up, but her arms buckled. Her muscles refused to obey, trembling so violently, she collapsed back against the floorboards with a soft gasp of frustration. Humiliation burned in her chest. She hated being weak. Weakness was what had allowed her stepmother to sell her. Seeing her struggle, Gideon closed the distance. He reached down his massive hands, aiming to lift her by the shoulders. The moment his fingers brushed the thick fabric of the duster, Sarah flinched. It was a violent, instinctual recoil. She shrank back against the wall, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide with a sudden blinding terror. In her stepmother's house, a raised hand meant a strike. A man reaching for her meant she was being appraised, handled like a mare at an auction. Gideon froze. He did not pull his hands back immediately, nor did he push forward. He held perfectly still, his dark eyes reading the stark fear in her face. He saw the way she guarded her pocket, the way she made herself as small as possible. He recognized the look of someone who had been broken by the very people who should have protected her. A muscle feathered in his tight jaw. Without a word, he lowered his hands. "I won't touch you," Gideon said softly. There was no anger in his tone, no wounded pride, only a flat, unbreakable vow. He took a deliberate step backward. Then, using his boot, he pushed the folded wool blanket closer to her. "Whenever you are ready, move to the blanket." He turned his back to her, offering the ultimate gesture of trust. He walked over to the fire and busied himself with the tin pot stirring the water. Sarah stared at his broad back, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was waiting for the anger. She was waiting for him to demand gratitude, to curse her, for her reluctance to remind her that he had just saved her life and therefore owned her. That was how the world worked. Debt and payment. But the anger never came. The silent giant simply tended to the fire. Slowly, painfully, Sarah dragged herself off the bare floorboards. She pulled the elk-hide duster tight around her shoulders and crawled onto the wool blanket. The heat from the stones enveloped her, easing the brutal shivering. A deep, exhausting fever was settling into her body, making her head swim. But for the first time in days, she felt the terrifying sensation of being warm. A few minutes later, Gideon turned around. He held a scarred tin cup. He knelt at the edge of the blanket, keeping a respectful distance, and set the cup on the floorboards between them. "Pine needle tea with a little sugar," he said. "Drink it slow. It will break the fever." He stood up and retreated to the wooden table across the room, sitting down in the shadows. He picked up his oiled rag and his Winchester rifle, resuming his quiet work. Sarah looked at the cup. Steam curled from the dark liquid. Her hands shook as she reached out, wrapping her frozen fingers around the warm tin. She brought it to her cracked lips and drank. It was sweet, earthy, and scalding in the best possible way. The heat rushed down her throat, settling in her stomach. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the firelight. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her since her father died. She looked across the room at the man in the shadows. He wasn't looking at her. He was giving her the dignity of a private moment. She lowered her chin to her knees, closing her eyes as the fever began to drag her towards sleep. The debt paper crinkled softly in her pocket, a cruel reminder that this safety was only an illusion. Tomorrow the storm would clear. Tomorrow the men who bought her would track the stagecoach route. The wind shrieked against the rusted iron sign outside, a constant, deafening roar. But then another sound cut through the storm. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the howling wind. But it came again, sharper, more frantic, the high, panicked whinny of a horse. Horses did not wander the winter pass alone. Where there were horses in a blizzard, there were riders pushing them to the brink of death. Sarah's eyes snapped open, the feverish haze vanishing in an instant. Her breath hitched. The cup trembled in her hands, spilling a few drops of warm tea onto the floorboards. They had found her. Across the room, Gideon did not jump. He did not curse. He simply laid the oiled rag down on the table. With a smooth, practiced motion, he lifted the Winchester rifle. The metallic asterisk, clack-clack asterisk of the lever action, chambering a heavy round, echoed through the small cabin, cold and absolute. He stood up, his dark eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. The metallic click of the Winchester rifle seemed to echo forever in the small fire-lit room. Sarah stopped breathing. She pulled her knees tight against her chest beneath the heavy elk-hide duster, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The men had come. The Creditor's hunters had tracked the stagecoach route through the freezing dark, and now they were outside. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the heavy thud of fists against the door, waiting for the rough voices demanding what was legally theirs. By the door, Gideon stood perfectly still. He was a statue of muscle and quiet violence. His broad shoulders squared, the rifle resting easily against his hip. His dark eyes were fixed on the thick oak planks. He listened. Beneath the shrieking of the wind and the rattling of the rusted iron sign outside, he parsed the sounds of the mountain pass. Minutes dragged by. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the stone chimney. The horse did not whinny again. There were no boots crunching on the frozen porch, no shouts carrying over the gale. Slowly, the overwhelming roar of the blue blizzard swallowed the mountain once more. Gideon did not lower the rifle immediately. He waited until he was certain. A stray, he murmured, his voice a low gravel that vibrated in the tight space. Or a rider blind in the storm, trusting his mount to keep moving. They didn't stop. He uncocked the hammer with a smooth motion, but kept the rifle close as he returned to his chair. He looked across the room at Sarah. She was trembling again, though not from the cold. The sheer terror in her wide blue eyes was a language he understood perfectly. "Sleep," he told her softly. "No one is coming through that door tonight. I sleep light." Sarah wanted to stay awake to keep watch over her own life, but the pine needle tea and the radiant heat from the hearth were a heavy narcotic. The exhaustion of surviving the ice finally dragged her under. She slipped into a deep, dreamless dark, her fingers still loosely curled over the pocket containing the debt paper. When she woke, the quality of the light in the room had changed. The harsh, blinding white of the storm had softened into a dull morning gray, seeping through the cracks in the window shutters. The wind no longer shrieked. It moaned a tired, hollow sound. Sarah blinked her vision, adjusting to the amber glow of the cabin. The fire had been built up, crackling merrily, and there was a smell rich, salty, and incredibly heavy. Her stomach violently twisted. Hunger, sharp and agonizing, clawed at her insides. She turned her head. Gideon was standing by the cast-iron stove. He wore a thick wool sweater over his broad frame, his elk-hide duster still wrapped safely around her. He was stirring a blackened skillet with a wooden spoon. The sizzle of salted pork and beans filled the air, a scent so intoxicating it made Sarah's mouth water painfully. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days, not since her stepmother had locked her in the cellar before the coach arrived. Hearing her shift, Gideon glanced over his shoulder. "Fever broke," he noted, his dark eyes assessing the color that had returned to her cheeks. He took the skillet off the heat. Using a cloth, he spooned a generous portion onto a battered tin plate, setting a thick piece of hardtack bread beside it. Just as he had done with the water, he did not walk right up to her. He crossed the room with heavy, quiet steps and set the plate on the edge of the floorboards, just within her reach. Then he took his own plate and sat down at the heavy wooden table, keeping his distance. "Eat," he instructed simply. Sarah slowly sat up. Her body was incredibly stiff, her joints aching from the residual cold, but the fatal numbness was gone. She pulled the duster tightly around her shoulders and reached for the plate. Her hands still shook slightly as she picked up the tin fork. She took the first bite. The hot grease and salt hit her tongue, and a small involuntary sound of relief escaped her throat. She ate quickly, manners entirely forgotten, driven by the pure animal instinct of a starving body. From across the room, Gideon ate his own meal in silence. He didn't stare, but he watched her. He saw the way she guarded the plate with her arm, eating like a dog that expected to be kicked. As the sharpest edge of her hunger dulled, Sarah slowed down. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence between them. In the brutal world, she knew charity did not exist. A meal was never just a meal. A warm fire was never free. Her stepmother had taught her that every breath under someone else's roof required payment. She looked at the massive, quiet man across the room. She waited for the questions. Asterisk. Who are you? Why were you dumped in the snow? Who is looking for you? What can you do for me in return? Asterisk. But Gideon just finished his food, set his plate aside, and began to sharpen a hunting knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic asterisk, asterisk of the steel against the stone was grounding. He asked for nothing. He demanded no gratitude. He offered a warm shelter, food, and absolute physical boundaries, leaving her with a sense of dignity she hadn't felt in years. A heavy knot formed in Sarah's throat. She pressed her hand against her dress pocket, feeling the crinkle of the wax-sealed debt paper. She was safe right now, sitting by this fire. But the paper was a ticking clock. If he knew what she was, a traded asset, a woman with a price tag and a legal bounty on her head, would he still let her sit by his fire? Gideon stood up, sheathing his knife. "Fire needs feeding," he said, breaking the long silence. "Woodpile is out back. Keep the door bolted until you hear me knock twice." He pulled on a heavy canvas coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder by habit, and unlatched the heavy oak door. The rusted hinges squealed in protest. The cold air that rushed in was biting, but the storm had definitely weakened into a steady driving snow. Gideon stepped out onto the frozen porch and pulled the door shut behind him. He heard the satisfying asterisk, clack asterisk, of the iron bolt sliding into place from the inside. She had locked it. Good. He walked down the creaking steps, his boots crunching heavily in the fresh snow. The air was blindingly cold, freezing the moisture in his breath instantly. He made his way toward the woodshed, leaning against the side of the station. As he reached for the first heavy log, his eyes caught a disturbance in the snow. Gideon froze. The wilderness was a canvas, and he was a master at reading it. The storm had laid down a fresh, unbroken layer of white over the yard during the night. But right near the edge of the woodshed, partially obscured by the drifting powder, was a depression. He crouched down, his gloved fingers brushing the loose snow away. It was a boot print. The heel was deep, digging into the frozen mud beneath the ice. And at the back of the heel, there was the unmistakable sharp indentation of a riding spur. It wasn't his boot. He wore flat-soled winter moccasins and heavy leather packs. Gideon's dark eyes narrowed, sweeping the tree line. The whinny from the night before hadn't been a stray horse passing blindly in the dark. Someone had stopped. Someone had dismounted, walked around the perimeter of the stagecoach station, while the storm raged and listened at the walls. The hunters were already here. Gideon stared at the spurred boot print stamped into the frozen mud. The hunter wasn't gone. He was circling, waiting for the storm to break just enough to see smoke rising from a chimney. Gideon stood up, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, violent readiness. He gathered an armful of split oak, concealing the urgency in his massive shoulders, just in case eyes were watching from the snowy tree line. He strode back to the porch, his boots making heavy, calculated thuds against the wood, and knocked twice. The heavy iron bolt slid back. Sarah stood in the doorway, the oversized elk-hide duster wrapped securely around her fragile frame. She stepped aside to let him in, but the moment he crossed the threshold, she felt the drastic shift in the air. The quiet, grounding calm of the mountain man had vanished. In its place was a lethal, coiled tension. Gideon dumped the firewood into the iron bin with a loud clatter. He turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You need to hide," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. "Now." The meager color that had returned to Sarah's face drained away instantly, leaving her as pale as the snow outside. Her hands instinctively flew to her stomach, grabbing the edges of the duster. "My back room," Gideon interrupted, pointing toward the heavy wooden door that used to serve as the station master's office. "Behind the old supply crates. Do not come out. If you hear me talking, do not make a sound. If you hear shooting, stay low to the floor." Sarah didn't argue. The brutal survival instinct she had honed under her stepmother's roof overrode her panic. She scrambled into the dark, windowless room, crouching behind a stack of rotting wooden crates. The smell of dust and old canvas filled her nose. She pulled his heavy leather duster over her head, making herself as small as humanly possible, pressing both hands tightly over her mouth to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing. In the main room, Gideon moved with terrifying efficiency. He kicked Sarah's tin plate far beneath the heavy table, hiding it in the deep shadows. He tossed the extra wool blanket into the corner chest. He checked the chamber of his Winchester, ensuring a heavy round was loaded, then leaned it casually against the stone hearth perfectly within reach of his right hand. He didn't have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, a heavy fist pounded on the front door. The rusted hinges rattled violently under the force. "Open up!" a voice barked, rough and impatient, muffled by the howling wind. Gideon took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lethal edge from his posture, replacing it with the dull, irritated glare of a hermit disturbed from his peace. He walked to the door and pulled back the iron bolt. The wind screamed into the room, bringing a blinding swirl of white snow. Standing on the porch was a man wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat. Ice clung to his unkempt beard, and his eyes were small, sharp, and predatory. He immediately darted his gaze past Gideon, trying to scan the interior of the dimly lit cabin. When the man shifted his weight, the sharp asterisk, clink asterisk of a riding spur echoed on the floorboards. The man from the boot print. "Passes blocked," the hunter grunted, stepping forward as if expecting an invitation. "Need to warm my bones." Gideon did not move an inch. His massive, broad-shouldered frame completely filled the doorway, an immovable wall of bone and muscle. He looked down at the hunter, his deep-set dark eyes flat unreadable and deeply unwelcoming. "Nearest town is 10 miles south," Gideon said, his voice a low, threatening rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "I don't run a boarding house." The hunter's eyes narrowed. He was a man used to intimidating frontier folk, leveraging the fear of the lawless outlands. But the giant standing before him carried the unmistakable aura of someone who had killed before and who would not hesitate to do it again over something as simple as a breached threshold. "I'm tracking lost property," the hunter said, changing his tactic. He casually reached inside his coat, keeping his hand deliberately near the butt of his holstered revolver. "Stage driver dumped a girl out this way yesterday. Small thing, brown hair, worth a fair bit of coin to a man back in town. You seen her?" In the pitch-black storage room, Sarah heard every word through the thin wooden walls. A violently cold sweat broke out across her skin. She bit down hard on her own wrist to keep her teeth from chattering. Asterisk property. Asterisk. That was all she was, a stray animal with a bounty to be collected. By the door, Gideon's expression did not change by a fraction of an inch. "I saw a coach push through before the storm hit full," he lied smoothly. "Didn't stop. Haven't seen a soul since." The hunter sniffed the air. "Smells like salt pork. And coffee." He tried again to peer around Gideon's massive arm. "Awful lot of heat and food for a man living alone in a dead station." "The cold makes a man hungry," Gideon replied. He shifted his weight just slightly, dropping his right hand closer to his side, directly in line with his own hunting knife. "And I don't like company when I eat." The silence stretched thick and heavy. The hunter weighed his options. He had a gun, but his hands were numb. He was tired, and he was standing out in the open wind. The man in the doorway was fully rested, warm, and giving off the distinct, terrifying impression that he was hoping the hunter would try something. The hunter spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snow, stepping back from the doorway. "If you find her," he sneered, a cruel smile touching his lips, "tie her up and keep her warm. My boss pays well for returned goods, but he breaks the hands of any man who touches what's his." "I'll keep that in mind," Gideon said softly. He stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door directly in the hunter's face, throwing the iron bolt so hard it clanged against the frame. Gideon stood by the door for a long time, his body tense, listening as the crunch of boots retreated off the porch, followed by the heavy snort of a horse being spurred back onto the frozen trail. He waited until the sound completely vanished into the wailing wind. Only then did the rigid line of his shoulders drop. He walked across the room and pulled open the door to the storage office. "He's gone," Gideon said quietly. Sarah uncurled from the dark corner. She was shaking so violently, her legs could barely support her weight. The hunter's words echoed in her skull like a death sentence. Asterisk, property, returned goods. She stepped out of the dark room, her vision swimming with unshed tears of pure panic. As she crossed the threshold into the firelight, the toe of her ruined shoe caught the uneven edge of a floorboard. She stumbled forward, her hands instinctively flying out to catch her balance. Gideon moved instantly, reaching out and catching her gently by the upper arm to steady her before she hit the floor. The sudden movement pulled harshly at the worn fabric of her torn gray dress. From the shallow frayed pocket she had guarded so desperately since she arrived, a folded square of parchment slipped free. It fluttered softly through the air, landing directly on the worn wooden floorboards between them. The heavy red wax seal gleamed like a drop of fresh blood in the amber light of the hearth. Thick black ink bled through the back of the page, outlining the unmistakable rigid shape of a debt ledger. Gideon looked down at the paper. Sarah froze the air, leaving her lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. Her hands flew to her empty pocket, then to her mouth. She looked from the fallen contract to the towering mountain man, the fragile illusion of her safety shattering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. The piece of parchment lay on the floorboards, stark white against the dark scuffed wood. The heavy red wax seal caught the firelight, gleaming like a fresh wound. For a second that stretched into an eternity, neither of them moved. The howling of the wind outside faded into a dull, meaningless roar beneath the rushing blood in Sarah's ears. Slowly, Gideon released his gentle grip on her arm. He crouched down his massive frame, casting a long, dark shadow over her, and picked up the paper. His large, rough fingers felt the thickness of the document, the undeniable weight of a contract. Sarah's chest hitched. A sound clawed its way up her throat, a raw, broken noise, half gasp, half sob. The fragile safety of the cabin, the warmth of the pine needle tea, the smell of the salted pork, it all evaporated. She was naked before the brutal reality of the frontier again. She watched Gideon's dark eyes track across the heavy black ink. She knew the words by heart, having read them in the freezing dark of the cellar before the coach arrived. Asterisk, received of Agatha Miller. The sum of $400. Complete transfer of guardianship and labor. Sarah Miller's stepdaughter. Bound to the mining camp. He knew. The silent, terrifying mountain man who had just stood down a bounty hunter now held the proof of her exact worth in his hands. He knew she wasn't a lost traveler. She was property. She was a stolen asset. "Please," Sarah whispered. Her voice was so fragile it cracked, barely carrying over the crackle of the hearth. Gideon did not look up from the paper. His jaw flexed, a hard, dangerous ridge of muscle shifting beneath his skin. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized her. The survival instinct that had kept her walking through the snow now pushed her to the very edge of her dignity. She dropped to her knees, the heavy elk-hide duster pooling around her on the floorboards. "I can work!" She blurted out the words, tumbling over each other in a desperate, breathless rush. "I can cook. I know how to mend clothes, how to skin game. I won't take up much space. I can sleep in the storage room without a fire. Just please don't give me back to them." Gideon finally lowered the paper. His deep-set eyes found her on the floor, curled into herself, offering up her labor, her comfort, her very humanity, just to avoid being returned to the men who bought her. "The man at the door," Sarah choked out, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "He said his boss breaks hands. They'll kill me. Or worse. I know I'm a debt. I know what I cost. If you keep me, I'll earn it back. I swear it. I'll earn every penny of it. Just please don't open that door for them." She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable. She waited for him to fold the paper and put it in his own pocket, to claim the bounty. Or worse, to realize that since he held the deed, he now owned the woman. She waited for the heavy hand to land on her shoulder, demanding the first payment of her desperate bargain. Instead, she heard the heavy crunch of his boots walking away from her. Sarah opened her eyes. Gideon had crossed the room to the stone hearth. He stood before the roaring fire, his broad back to her, staring down into the dancing orange flames. He looked at the heavy parchment in his hand one last time. Then, without a single word, he tossed it into the fire. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The heavy parchment landed squarely on a glowing bed of red-hot oak coals. The thick red wax seal hissed violently, melting into a dark boiling puddle. Within seconds, the edges of the paper curled upward, turning brown, then black, before bursting into bright, consuming flames. The black ink, the numbers, the signatures, the price of her life disintegrated into white ash and was sucked up the dark stone chimney by the draft. It was gone. The only proof that she belonged to anyone in this world was gone. Gideon turned around. The firelight cast his harsh, weathered features in deep relief. He looked at the woman kneeling on his floor, wrapped in his coat, shivering from a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. He crossed the room, stopping just out of her reach, honoring the boundary he had silently promised to keep. "A piece of paper does not make a person a thing," Gideon said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, completely devoid of pity, but anchored in an unshakable, absolute truth. "You are not a debt, you are not an asset, and you are not property." Sarah stared at the empty fireplace, then up at the giant of a man standing before her. A violent shudder ripped through her body, and the dam finally broke. The tears she had refused to shed when her stepmother cast her out, the tears she had held back when the driver threw her in the snow, poured down her face. She pressed her face into her hands, weeping with the quiet, devastating force of a soul that had been crushed and suddenly given room to breathe. Gideon did not shush her. He did not tell her to be brave. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable guard, letting her mourn the cruelty of the world, while ensuring it could no longer touch her. When her sobs finally slowed to exhausted, trembling breaths, Gideon took a step forward. He reached down, grasped the collar of the heavy elk-hide duster, and gently pulled it tighter around her shoulders, coaxing her to stand. "You don't owe me anything," he told her quietly, looking directly into her red, tear-streaked eyes. "This cabin is mine. As long as you are inside it, you are safe." Sarah looked up at him, her chest aching with a profound, terrifying surge of hope. For the first time in her life, she believed a man's word. But the wilderness was a cruel master, and it rarely allowed peace to linger. As if waiting for the contract to burn, the shrieking blue blizzard outside suddenly dropped its pitch. The wind died down from a deafening roar to a hollow, haunting moan. And in that brief pocket of quiet, a new sound bled through the thick timber walls. It was a deep, resonant baying, a sound that belonged to nightmare and blood. Sarah froze, the blood draining from her face. Gideon's head snapped toward the heavy oak door, his jaw locked. It wasn't just one hound, it was a pack. And behind the frantic, aggressive barking of the dogs came the heavy, synchronized crunch of at least half a dozen horses pushing through the deep snow. The scout hadn't just ridden off. He had ridden back to the main trail to meet the rest of his party. The Creditor hadn't just sent men, he had come himself. "Stay behind the stove," Gideon ordered, his voice suddenly stripped of all warmth, leaving only cold, hard iron. He didn't look at her as he reached for the Winchester rifle. He checked the chamber one more time, his thumb resting heavily on the hammer. Outside, the horses came to a halt in the abandoned stagecoach yard. A man's voice, sharp and accustomed to absolute authority, shouted an order to quiet the dogs. The hunt was over. The siege had begun. The heavy crunch of boots on the frozen porch sounded like a drumbeat of execution. Behind the rusted cast-iron stove, Sarah curled into the smallest shape she could manage. She pulled the thick elk-hide duster over her head, her hands clamped over her ears, but it was useless. The aggressive guttural snarling of the hunting dogs bled through the timber walls, mingling with the impatient snorting of tired horses. There were at least 6 men out there. 6 armed, angry men who had ridden through a blue blizzard to reclaim a $400 debt. "Open the door, mountain man," a voice boomed from the porch. It was not the rough, gravelly voice of the scout from earlier. This voice was sharp, educated, and dripping with the absolute arrogance of a man who owned everything he looked at. Gideon did not flinch. He stood in the center of the room, his thumb resting lightly on the hammer of his Winchester rifle. He glanced back at Sarah, ensuring she was completely hidden in the deep shadows behind the stove. "Stay low," Gideon murmured, his voice barely carrying over the crackle of the hearth. "Cover your ears." He turned back to the heavy oak door. He didn't shout back. He didn't ask what they wanted. He walked forward with the slow, terrifying deliberation of an avalanche, grabbed the iron bolt, and slid it back with a loud metallic asterisk, clack, asterisk. He pulled the door open. The wind howled, rushing into the warm cabin and sending a swirl of white powder across the floorboards. Gideon stepped directly into the threshold, completely filling the doorframe. The amber firelight from the hearth spilled out behind him, casting his massive silhouette into the swirling storm. Standing at the bottom of the porch steps was the Creditor. He was a tall man wrapped in a lavish, heavy wolf fur coat, his face red from the biting cold, his eyes hard and calculating. Behind him stood 5 hired guns, their hands resting on the butts of their holstered revolvers. 2 of them struggled to hold back the heavy leather leashes of 3 snarling tracking hounds. "I am Bartholomew Vance," the Creditor announced, his voice slicing through the wind. "I own the mining camp at Black Ridge, and you, friend, are harboring a runaway." Gideon stood perfectly still. The bitter wind whipped at his dark silver-streaked hair, but he didn't so much as blink. "There are no runaways here," he said, his voice a flat, dead calm that stood in stark contrast to the screaming storm. Vance's eyes narrowed. He stepped up onto the first step of the porch, trying to peer past Gideon's broad shoulders. "My scout says otherwise." He tracked the stagecoach. He saw the boot prints in the yard. "I hold a legal wax-sealed contract transferring guardianship of a girl named Sarah Miller to my camp. She is my property, legally bought and paid for. Now step aside." Inside, hidden behind the iron stove, Sarah stopped breathing. The reality of the law was a crushing weight. Vance had the money. Vance had the men. The frontier sheriffs worked for men like him. Gideon was just one man living in a ruined station. If he fought them, he would die, and she would be dragged away over his bleeding corpse. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She was ready to stand up. She was ready to walk out the door to save the only man who had ever shown her mercy. But before she could move, Gideon's voice rumbled through the cabin, deep and unshakable. "I know the paper you're talking about," Gideon said. Vance stopped trying to look inside and locked eyes with the giant on the porch. A cruel, triumphant smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Then you are a reasonable man. Bring her out. I'll even compensate you for the trouble of keeping her from freezing. $10 for the night's lodging." "You can't have her," Gideon replied smoothly, "and your contract is worthless." The Creditor's smile vanished. "I have a signed deed." "You had a signed deed," Gideon corrected him, his tone chillingly indifferent. "It made good kindling, burned up about 10 minutes ago." For a second, the only sound was the howling of the winter wind. Vance stared at Gideon, his face twisting from arrogance into pure, unadulterated rage. Destroying a legal debt paper was a crime on the frontier, a direct challenge to the power structures that men like Vance relied upon. "You stupid backwoods savage," Vance hissed, stepping up onto the porch. He gestured sharply to the armed men behind him. "You think burning a piece of paper changes anything I paid for her? I own her. And if I have to burn this rotting shack to the ground to drag her out of the ashes, I will." The 5 hired guns drew their revolvers. The metallic clicks of hammers being cocked cut through the storm like snapping bones. The hounds lunged forward, their chains snapping taut. Inside the cabin, Sarah buried her face in her hands, her heart shattering. It was over. But Gideon Hale did not step back. He did not seek cover behind the thick oak doorframe. With a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Gideon raised the Winchester rifle from his hip and leveled it directly at Bartholomew Vance's chest. The heavy asterisk, clack, clack, asterisk of the lever action, chambering a fresh round, echoed off the porch roof, a sound so loud and definitive it silenced the snarling dogs. "Take another step," Gideon said. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice to compete with the storm. He spoke with the terrifying quiet certainty of a man who had already calculated the exact geometry of death. "I know your kind, Vance," Gideon continued, his dark eyes locked onto the Creditor, completely ignoring the 5 guns pointed at him. "You buy people because you're too weak to earn loyalty. You hide behind hired guns because you've never fought a real battle in your life. Vance swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the dark, gaping muzzle of the Winchester. There are 6 of us, he spat, though his voice wavered slightly. You can't shoot us all before you go down. I don't have to, Gideon replied, his voice dropping into a deadly, gravelly whisper. My first round shatters your spine. You'll be dead before your knees hit the snow. The second round takes the man on your left. The third takes the scout. By the time the rest of your boys realize they aren't getting paid because their boss's chest is blown open, they'll run. I've seen it 100 times on the trail. Gideon took a deliberate half-step forward, crossing the threshold, bringing the barrel of the rifle mere inches from Vance's heavy wolf fur coat. So, Gideon murmured, his aura suffocating the air around them, who wants to earn their pay today? The silence that followed was suffocating. The hired guns looked at each other, the icy wind biting at their faces. The man holding the rifle didn't look like a desperate trapper making an empty threat. He looked like the frontier itself, unforgiving, brutal, and absolutely indifferent to a man's wealth. He was an apex predator, holding his ground, and every man in the yard suddenly realized that if the shooting started, the mountain man might die, but he was going to take the richest man here to hell with him. Vance stood frozen on the porch. The heat from the cabin washed over his face, but he had never felt so cold in his entire life. The heavy silence on the frozen porch felt thicker than the blizzard itself. Bartholomew Vance stared down the dark, unblinking barrel of the Winchester rifle. The wind whipped the expensive wolf fur collar around his face, but his skin had gone entirely pale. He was a man who calculated everything in numbers, debts, wages, bounties, and profit. But staring into the dead, empty eyes of the mountain man, Vance realized there was no math that could save him here. Gideon Hale was not negotiating. He was simply stating the order in which men were going to die. Vance slowly shifted his gaze to the 5 hired guns standing in the yard. The men were tough, seasoned frontier killers, but they were also mercenaries. They worked for silver, not out of loyalty. The scout, the man who had tracked the stagecoach the night before, slowly lowered the hammer of his revolver with his thumb. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the snow and took a deliberate step backward, pulling his horse's reins. $40 ain't enough to get my chest blown open, the scout muttered. I'm out. The fragile loyalty of the pack shattered instantly. Seeing the scout back down, the other 4 men slowly lowered their weapons. The tracking hounds whined, sensing the sudden evaporation of aggression, their tails dropping between their legs. Vance's jaw clenched in profound, humiliating defeat. He looked back at Gideon, his upper lip curling into a sneer of wounded pride. She's a broken, useless thing, Vance spat, trying to salvage some fragment of his authority. She'll starve out here with you. She isn't worth my blood. Gideon didn't lower the rifle. Get off my porch! Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the cold, absolute promise in Gideon's eyes forced him to turn around. He marched stiffly down the wooden steps, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He mounted his dark gelding, pulling the reins so hard the horse tossed its head in protest. You'll freeze before the thaw, mountain man, Vance called out over his shoulder. Gideon said nothing. He stood like a statue of iron and leather, watching as the Creditor and his men turned their horses back toward the frozen trail. He waited on the threshold as the howling wind swallowed the sound of the hooves, watching until the swirling white snow erased their dark silhouettes completely. They were gone, and they would not come back. Men like Vance only hunted when the prey was helpless. Slowly, Gideon took a step back inside the ruined stagecoach station. He gripped the heavy iron handle of the oak door and pulled it shut. The loud metallic asterisk, clack asterisk of the heavy iron bolt sliding into place echoed through the cabin. It was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. Behind the rusted cast iron stove, Sarah uncurled her trembling body. She pushed the heavy elk-hide duster back from her face, her breathing shallow and ragged. The adrenaline that had kept her paralyzed in the dark was suddenly draining away, leaving her limbs weak and heavy. Gideon walked to the wooden table. He uncocked the hammer of the Winchester and set the rifle down gently. He took a deep breath, the massive tense line of his broad shoulders finally dropping. The lethal coiled violence that had filled the room only moments ago vanished, replaced once again by the quiet, grounding presence of the lonely frontiersman. He turned and looked toward the stove. Sarah slowly stood up. Her legs wobbled and she had to lean a hand against the cool stone of the chimney to keep from falling. She looked at the heavy oak door, then down at the hearth. The fire was still burning brightly, the oak logs popping and hissing. There was no trace of the red wax seal. There was no trace of the heavy black ink. The debt was ash. She looked up at Gideon. Her ocean blue eyes were wide, brimming with tears that spilled over her pale cheeks, catching the amber firelight. "They're gone," Gideon said softly. His deep, gravelly voice was a stark contrast to the death threat he had just issued on the porch. "You," Sarah's voice broke. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the overwhelming sob rising in her chest. "You could have died. There were 6 of them. You didn't even know me. Why would you do that?" Gideon crossed the room, stopping a few feet away from her, forever mindful of the invisible boundary between them. He looked down at her, seeing the years of cruelty and neglect etched into her fragile posture. He saw a woman who had been taught that every breath she took was a burden to someone else. "A long time ago, I watched good people get left behind because the world decided they weren't worth the trouble to save," Gideon said, his dark eyes shadowed by old, quiet ghosts. "I promised myself I wouldn't live in a world like that anymore, so I left it." He gestured toward the fire. "I didn't open that door yesterday to collect a debt. I opened it because no one deserves to freeze in the dark, and I didn't chase those men away to own you. You belong to yourself, Sarah. You are free to walk out that door when the snow melts, or..." He paused, the heavy silence of the mountain cabin stretching between them, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the distant, defeated moan of the wind outside. "Or you can stay," Gideon finished quietly. "There is plenty of wood, there is plenty of food, and no one will ever treat you like property again as long as I have breath in my lungs." Sarah stared at him. The sheer weight of his words settled over her bruised spirit like a warm, heavy blanket. Her entire life she had been a problem, to be solved a debt, to be paid a burden, to be traded. But standing here in this abandoned stagecoach station at the edge of the world, she was finally just a human being. She let go of the stone chimney. With slow, hesitant steps, she closed the distance between them. She didn't shrink away. She didn't guard her empty pocket. She reached out her small, trembling hand, grasping the thick wool of his sleeve. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Gideon looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The harsh lines of his weathered features softened into something incredibly gentle. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't demand a romantic vow. He simply covered her small, cold hand with his large, warm one, accepting her trust. Outside, the blue blizzard continued to rage against the mountainside, burying the frontier under a merciless sheet of ice. But inside the old station, the rusted hinges held firm. The heavy oak door stood like an impenetrable shield against the cruelty of the world. Sarah pulled the elk-hide duster tighter around her shoulders, the scent of wood smoke and pine filling her senses. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire completely thawing the last of the ice in her heart. She wasn't an abandoned bride. She wasn't a runaway asset. For the first time in her life, she was simply home. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In a world that forces us to be strong, there is a profound, breathtaking beauty in finding the one person who finally lets us rest. Have you ever felt the exhaustion of carrying your burdens alone, only to have someone step in and say, "You're safe now"? If Sarah and Gideon's journey through the brutal winter pass touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. May we all find our one safe place in the storm.